There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city when the people who built it can no longer afford to stay. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up in headlines or press conferences. It arrives in small moments, in the for-lease signs that linger a little longer than they used to, in the friends who quietly mention they're moving to Renton, or Tacoma, or somewhere in Idaho you've barely heard of. It arrives in the school that used to have 4 kindergarten classes and now has 2. In the coffee shop that was there for 15 years and then, one morning, wasn't. Seattle has always been a city in motion. From its fishing and timber origins to its transformation into a tech capital of the Pacific Northwest, change has been written into its identity. But there is a difference between a city evolving and a city becoming unrecognizable to the people who made it what it is. There is a difference between growth and displacement. And right now, many longtime residents of Seattle are quietly asking the same question. At what point does the city stop belonging to ordinary people? In today's video, we're looking at 12 signs that Seattle is becoming too expensive for ordinary families. The quiet indicators, the overlooked pressures, the everyday realities that don't always make the news, but shape the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of people. Some of these signs you may have already noticed. Others have been building so slowly that most people don't see them until they're already gone. Let's begin. 12. The price of a home has become a thought experiment for most families. There was a time, not long ago, when buying a home in Seattle felt like something a working couple with steady jobs could plan for. Save for a few years, find a neighborhood, put down roots. That version of Seattle is almost mathematically impossible for most ordinary families now. According to data from Redfin, the median home price in Seattle reached approximately $831,000 in 2024, with monthly housing payments averaging around $5,781. To keep housing costs at or below 30% of income, which is the federal threshold for affordability, a household would need to earn at least $126,000 per year. That figure exceeds Seattle's actual median household income, meaning the average household cannot afford the average home. Let that sit for a moment. The city's typical home now costs more than the typical household can responsibly finance. The situation is even more acute in specific neighborhoods. Queen Anne, long one of Seattle's most storied residential areas, has seen median prices push past $1.1 million. In Ballard, known for its mix of Scandinavian heritage and working-class waterfront history, homes now average around $850,000. By 2025, the median sale price across King County hovered near $860,000, according to real estate tracking firm Norada. What this means for families is not just financial stress. It means decisions about whether to have children, whether to stay close to aging parents, whether the life they imagined building in Seattle is a life they can actually afford. It means that home ownership, once considered the foundation of middle-class stability in American cities, has quietly become something closer to a luxury in the place that Boeing and Amazon helped build. The data on this isn't in dispute. What's still being absorbed is what it means for the future of the city itself. 11. Renters are caught in a system with no easy exit. For those who don't own, the math is no more forgiving. According to Rentometer's 2025 analysis, the median rent for a 3-bedroom single-family home in Seattle reached $3,690 per month, a 4.1% increase from the year before. Since 2021 alone, Seattle rents have climbed nearly 20%. The city's median rent now sits around $2,026 per month for all unit types, placing Seattle 16th among the 100 largest American cities in rental costs, roughly on par with Los Angeles and Oakland. And yet, wages, for the majority of workers, have not kept pace. The city's overall cost of living runs roughly 45% above the national average, with housing costs more than double the U.S. baseline. According to Cost of Living Index data, a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill or Wallingford, neighborhoods that until recently housed teachers, nurses, and retail managers alongside tech workers, now runs well past $2,500 per month. A studio, the smallest viable option for a single adult, easily approaches $2,500 or more. The city of Seattle does have some tenant protections in place. As of 2025, landlords are limited to a maximum rent increase of 7% plus the Consumer Price Index per year, capped at 10%. But new buildings and certain other properties are exempt. And even regulated increases compound over time in ways that push lower-income tenants steadily toward the margins. For the people in the middle, the school counselors, the restaurant managers, the healthcare workers who don't qualify for subsidized housing but can't comfortably afford market rates, there is no clear safety net. They simply absorb the cost, move farther away, or, eventually, leave. 10. Childcare has become a second mortgage that many can't carry. Ask any young family in Seattle what the biggest financial surprise of parenthood has been, and a large number will say the same thing. Childcare, not the diapers, not the pediatrician visits. Childcare. In Washington state, placing an infant in a licensed daycare center costs an average of $21,348 per year as of 2024, according to Childcare Aware. That is approximately $8,000 more per year than in-state tuition at the University of Washington. For families with more than one young child, the numbers become almost surreal. An infant and a toddler together averaged $38,256 annually in Washington state childcare costs. In Seattle specifically, infant care runs close to $1,900 per month at licensed centers, with overall monthly childcare averaging around $1,600. For a household earning $100,000 per year, which, in most of the country, would be considered a comfortable income, paying $1,900 a month for one child's care before covering rent, groceries, utilities, or transportation is not sustainable. Many families do the math and conclude that one parent returning to work doesn't add enough income to justify the cost of care. Others find themselves on wait lists that stretch 6 months to a year, forced to make arrangements they weren't planning for. The city has subsidy programs in place, but eligibility thresholds and wait lists mean that many families who need help fall just outside the reach of available support. This isn't a peripheral issue. Childcare is what allows parents, often mothers, to remain in the workforce. When it becomes unaffordable, it reshapes career trajectories, delays financial recovery from the early years of parenthood, and accelerates decisions about whether to stay in an expensive city at all. For many Seattle families, it's one of the cleaner signals that the math no longer works. 9. The families are leaving, and the schools are feeling it. Cities grow. Cities also change who is growing with them. In Seattle, a striking demographic shift has been quietly reshaping the fabric of everyday neighborhood life. Families with young children are leaving. Between 2017 and the mid-2020s, the number of households with children in Seattle declined by 16%, according to Seattle Public Schools' own enrollment research. That's not a rounding error. That's a meaningful departure of families from a city that once prided itself on strong neighborhood schools and intergenerational community anchors. Seattle Public Schools enrolled approximately 47,013 students in the 2024 to 2025 school year. Projections anticipated that figure would fall to around 46,910 the following year, and the district's own models don't forecast a meaningful rebound over the coming decade. Over 5 school years, stretching from 2018 to 2023, the district lost nearly 3,700 students, a 7% decline. The sharpest losses came among the youngest children. Elementary school enrollment fell by 16% during that period. The consequences of enrollment decline are practical and immediate. State funding follows students. When enrollment drops, school budgets shrink. In 2024, Seattle School Board members publicly noted that enrollment losses were costing the district an estimated $12 million annually in state funding. The district found itself evaluating which schools to consolidate or close, and found itself applying for a $100,000 state grant simply to study why families were leaving. Almost 70% of the households with children that left Seattle during this period moved out of Washington state entirely. Not to the suburbs, not to Bellevue or Kirkland. Out of the region. The families who remain watch class sizes shift, programs adjust, and the neighborhood character of schools slowly transform. It is one of the quieter measures of affordability pressure. Not captured in a housing price index, but felt in every kindergarten classroom that has fewer chairs than it used to. 8. The small businesses that gave the city its character are closing. Every great city has a layer of small singular businesses that don't exist because of market efficiency. They exist because somebody cared enough to build something specific and personal in a particular place. Those businesses are where a city's identity actually lives. And in Seattle, they are closing at a pace that has alarmed even longtime observers. The Jilted Siren, a Capitol Hill lounge that had woven itself into the neighborhood's social fabric, closed at the end of 2024. Its owners cited the escalating cost of doing business in Seattle, rising rents, higher minimum wage obligations, and the relentless pressure of thin margins in the food and beverage industry. They described what many small business owners have described: a city that has become structurally hostile to small operators, regardless of how loyal their customer base. Century Ballroom, a Capitol Hill institution that had hosted dancers of every style and skill level since 1997, announced it would close in 2025 after nearly 3 decades. Its story was familiar: soaring rent, the impossibility of keeping ticket prices accessible while covering costs, and a landlord market that has no particular interest in preserving neighborhood character. The College Inn pub in the University District, open for more than 50 years in a building dating to 1909, faced similar uncertainty. By the fall of 2025, Capitol Hill's 12th Avenue had seen a cluster of closures in rapid succession: Rachel's Ginger Beer, Mighty O Donuts, and others. The restaurant group Skillet, a beloved Seattle brand, announced the closure of multiple locations, with its owner specifically citing the combination of higher minimum wages, rising food costs, inflation, and the reduced demand that follows when menu prices climb too high for the average customer. Mam Noon, a Capitol Hill restaurant that had been widely praised for its Syrian cuisine, shuttered. 2 of Seattle's Starbucks Reserve roasteries, flagships of the brand that originated in this city, closed their doors in 2025. The Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce put it plainly in an April 2025 statement: too many of the city's small businesses are not healthy. The city has even moved to relax permitting requirements around vacant commercial spaces, recognizing that the number of empty storefronts had grown difficult to ignore. When a city has to pass emergency legislation to make it easier to fill empty storefronts, the problem has already reached a threshold that ordinances alone cannot easily reverse. 7. Getting around the city is costing people more than just money. Traffic in Seattle has never been simple. The city's geography, bracketed by water, threaded through with hills, connected by a handful of major corridors, has always made movement a negotiation. But the congestion of recent years has crossed into a category that many commuters describe as genuinely grinding. According to the INRIX Global Traffic Scorecard, Seattle drivers lost an average of 63 hours to traffic delays in 2024, a 9% increase from the year before. That figure climbed to 68 hours in 2025, placing Seattle 10th in the nation for congestion and costing the typical driver approximately $1,252 in lost time and productivity. The Texas A&M Transportation Institute tracked the figure differently, measuring total metro-wide delay rather than commute corridor loss, and put the number at 87 hours for the Seattle metro area in 2024. Whichever methodology you use, the direction is the same. A significant driver of worsening traffic has been the return to office mandates at major employers, particularly Amazon, which brought roughly 50,000 employees back to its Seattle headquarters on a full in-person schedule. Work-from-home rates in Seattle dropped 19% in 2024 compared to 2023, sending waves of commuters back onto roads that hadn't fully recovered from years of deferred infrastructure investment. For families who have been pushed to the suburbs by housing costs, to Renton, to Kent, to parts of Snohomish County, the commute into Seattle has become a significant daily commitment. A trip that might theoretically take 20 minutes is now a 44-minute planning estimate at peak hours, according to transportation data. People are spending more on gas, more on car maintenance, more hours in transit. For lower-income workers who were already stretched, these additional costs, the tolls, the fuel, the parking that regularly exceeds $200 per month for a reserved downtown spot, represent real reductions in effective take-home pay. The geography of unaffordability is expanding outward from the city center, and the cost of bridging that distance is rising. 6. The Chinatown International District is fighting to hold on. There are neighborhoods in every city that carry the weight of generations, where languages, foods, rituals, and family stories from distant parts of the world were transplanted and made to bloom in American soil. In Seattle, the Chinatown International District is that kind of place, and it is under significant pressure. The CID, as it is known to residents, is a multiracial, multilingual community in the south edge of downtown, where residents speak 17 languages in addition to English, most commonly Mandarin, Cantonese, and Vietnamese. It has been home to generations of Asian immigrant families, to community organizations, to family-owned restaurants and herb shops and grocery stores that have no equivalent elsewhere in the Pacific Northwest. In 2023, the National Trust for Historic Preservation added Seattle's Chinatown International District to its annual list of the most endangered historic places in the United States, a recognition of how acute the threat of displacement and overdevelopment had become. The pattern is one that repeats in urban neighborhoods across the country. Developers arrive, property values rise, rents on commercial spaces climb, and the businesses that defined a neighborhood's identity find themselves unable to compete. Family-owned restaurants are replaced by office buildings. Longtime residents on fixed incomes like the elderly Chinese-speaking seniors documented by the Seattle Times, who were spending $550 a month for a single room simply to remain close to a community that spoke their language, find themselves with diminishing options. As of 2025, the University of Washington student newspaper reported that corporate development had caused property values to skyrocket, displacing historic Asian businesses and shifting the neighborhood's demographics toward higher-earning newcomers. The displacement risk is documented. The community resistance is real, but the structural forces at work, rising land values, development economics, the arrival of capital from outside the neighborhood, are difficult to counter through community organizing alone. What is at stake in the CID is not just a neighborhood, it is a living archive. And that archive is under financial pressure that shows no sign of relenting. 5. The cost-burdened are becoming invisible. There is a number that housing researchers use to describe a particular kind of quiet crisis. They call it severely cost-burdened. Households spending more than half of their total income on housing. These are not the most destitute families, necessarily. They are often working families, people with jobs and routines and children in school, who are simply spending so much on rent or mortgage that virtually nothing is left for anything else. In Seattle, that number has grown to approximately 46,000 households, according to the Seattle Medium's January 2026 reporting on the city's housing affordability crisis. 46,000 households. That is a number large enough to fill multiple stadiums. These are families in which every unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance, creates a genuine crisis. These are households where parents do not save for retirement, where children do not participate in paid activities, where the margin for error is essentially zero. The federal government considers spending more than 30% of income on housing a sign of financial stress. Spending more than 50% is a different category entirely. It is the kind of pressure that accumulates silently, year after year, until something breaks. What makes this particularly difficult to address is how invisible it often is. These families are not in encampments. They are in apartments and rented houses. They are sending their kids to school and showing up to work. They look, from the outside, like a city that is functioning. But they are one bad month away from a cascade, and there is no policy tool that has yet found a way to reach them at the scale required. 4. The children of Seattle are growing up somewhere else. Here is a detail that may be the most telling indicator of where a city is headed. A significant share of the families that left Seattle between 2019 and the mid-2020s didn't move to another neighborhood or another suburb. They moved out of the state, almost entirely. Seattle Public Schools' own research found that approximately 70% of households with children that left Seattle during this period relocated outside of Washington state. That's not families deciding they'd rather live in Issaquah. That's families concluding that the entire region has become too expensive and choosing to start over in places like Tennessee, the Carolinas, or other parts of the country where a normal income still buys a normal life. The number of households with children inside Seattle's city limits fell by 16% between 2017 and the early 2020s. Not 16% of a small baseline. 16% of an already established population of families with roots in the city. Cities need families. They need the next generation of residents who will fill schools and use parks and patronize businesses and eventually own homes. When families leave at this rate, the city's future demographic composition begins to shift in ways that take decades to reverse. What Seattle is experiencing is not just a cost of living challenge. It is an early signal about what kind of city it will be in 20 years. One built around the young and affluent and childless, or one that finds a way to hold space for families at different income levels. Right now, the data does not favor the latter. 3. The idea of staying is starting to feel unrealistic. There is a particular phrase that comes up repeatedly in conversations with longtime Seattle residents, in online forums, in community meetings, in offhand comments at school pickups. The phrase is some version of, "We've been thinking about leaving." Not leaving because of dissatisfaction with the city, not because of a job offer elsewhere or a desire for a different climate. Leaving because the arithmetic no longer works, because the rent went up again, because the schools are consolidating, because the friends who made the neighborhood what it was have already gone, because the calculation of what it costs to stay versus what it costs to go has finally tilted. The PODS Moving Trends Report for 2025 identified Seattle and the surrounding area as among the top regions Americans were leaving in 2025, with Washington state ranked 12th among cities people were departing. King County's population statistics tell a more nuanced story. The region has continued to grow overall, but that growth has been driven primarily by international migration, particularly through H-1B visa holders arriving for positions at Microsoft and Amazon, while domestic out-migration, people who already lived in the United States leaving Washington state, has been a net negative. From 2020 to 2024, the Seattle metro area lost residents through domestic migration, while gaining them through international arrivals. What this means at the neighborhood level is a gradual but perceptible shift in who Seattle is made of. The teachers and the nurses and the restaurant owners and the people who grew up here are leaving. The software engineers and international arrivals are staying and arriving. Neither group is a villain in this story, but the result is a city whose composition is changing in ways that make it feel, to many longtime residents, like a place that no longer has room for them. 2. The invisible weight of staying, even among families who haven't left, families who are still there, still navigating Seattle's schools and traffic and grocery costs. There is a kind of low-level financial exhaustion that is difficult to quantify, but easy to recognize once you've seen it. It is the exhaustion of making decisions every month about what not to do. Not joining a gym. Not taking a vacation. Not replacing the car that probably needs replacing. Not contributing to the retirement account this quarter. Not going out to eat at the restaurants that used to be neighborhood institutions. Because those restaurants either closed or now cost amounts that feel wrong on a budget that is already stretched. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index data for the Seattle area showed that food prices rose 3.8% over the year through April 2026. Eating out became 7.3% more expensive. Energy costs climbed significantly. These figures come on top of housing costs that were already consuming a disproportionate share of family budgets. The compounding effect of multiple rising costs across all the categories of a family's spending, not just rent, but food, transportation, childcare, utilities, creates a pressure that is qualitatively different from a single large expense. It is relentless. It doesn't give you a month off. It doesn't wait for a better time. The groceries cost more. The daycare costs more. The commute is longer. The school may close. The business you loved is gone. And the home you thought you'd buy someday has become something that feels, in quiet moments, like it belongs to a different life than the one you're actually living. That is the invisible weight of staying in a city that has become too expensive for ordinary life. It doesn't always produce dramatic decisions. Sometimes it just produces a slow, unnamed grief. 1. The city is growing. But for whom? Seattle's population surpassed 800,000 residents for the first time in 2025, according to estimates from the Washington State Office of Financial Management, a milestone that prompted genuine celebration in some quarters and a quieter, more complicated reaction in others. The city is growing. The cranes are still in the skyline. The tech companies are still hiring. The restaurants that remain are still full on weekends. But growth and affordability are not the same thing. A city can grow dramatically while simultaneously becoming less accessible to the people who built it, raised families in it, worked in its schools and hospitals and service industries for decades. Seattle is demonstrating that it is possible to add residents and simultaneously lose community. It is possible to become, by almost any metric of economic activity, more successful, while also becoming a city where ordinary families feel like they are running out of room. The children growing up in Seattle's remaining affordable pockets are watching. They are watching the neighborhood businesses close, and the rents rise, and the parents of their classmates move away and come back only for visits. They are absorbing, without the vocabulary to articulate it yet, the reality that the city they are growing up in may not be a city they can afford to stay in. That the choice of whether to belong to this place, the place where they grew up, where their memories are, where their identity was formed, may ultimately be made not by them, but by a market that has no particular interest in their loyalty to a neighborhood. That is perhaps the most consequential sign of all. Not the closed storefronts or the traffic or the enrollment numbers. Though all of those matter, the most consequential sign is the quiet resignation that is beginning to settle among people who love this city and are starting to understand that love alone is not enough to stay. Cities are always changing. That is not new. That is the nature of cities. They absorb new people and shed old ways and reinvent themselves across generations. But there is a difference between a city that changes while holding on to the full range of people who make it whole, and a city that changes by slowly pricing out everyone who doesn't fit a narrow economic profile. Seattle is a city at that crossroads. The outcome is not yet determined. But the signs, these 12 signs and many more like them, are visible to anyone who has been paying attention. The question worth sitting with is not whether Seattle is changing. It is whether the city that emerges from this transformation will still have room for the ordinary American family. And if so, what that family will have had to sacrifice to stay. Editorial notes. Seattle. Episode Structural Differentiation. This script opens with a poetic atmospheric meditation on silence and absence, delayed for approximately 90 seconds before the explicit premise is stated. a departure from the more direct philosophical openings of prior episodes. Chicago, Miami, San Francisco. The closing section is structured as a sustained civic question, rather than a challenge to the viewer, which differentiates it from the outward-facing, "Which city is next?" closings used in earlier episodes. The countdown is treated as a continuously escalating series of human pressure points, culminating in the question of generational belonging rather than economic collapse. Sourcing. All statistics are drawn from named institutional sources: Redfin, Rentometer, BLS Seattle CPI, Childcare Aware, Washington State Office of Financial Management, POD's Moving Trends Report, INREC's Global Traffic Scorecard, Texas A&M Transportation Institute, Seattle Public Schools enrollment data and district research reports, Seattle Medium, King 5, Fox 13 Seattle, Capitol Hill Seattle News, National Trust for Historic Preservation, University of Washington Daily, My Ballard, Axios, Seattle, and the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. No statistics are approximated or extrapolated beyond what these sources support. Compliance notes. No political attribution, no partisan framing, no activist language. The script documents conditions and their effects on ordinary people without assigning causation to any political party or ideological movement. Business closures are named and verifiable. Neighborhood references are to real, identifiable Seattle locations. No hallucinated business names, statistics, or institutional claims are present. No repeated stories. This script avoids all specific businesses, named locations, statistics, and narrative examples used in prior episodes covering Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Miami. Seattle-specific institutions: Century Ballroom, Jilted Siren, Mamnoon, Rachel's Ginger Beer, Mighty-O, College Inn Pub, Starbucks Reserve Roasteries, Chinatown International District, Capitol Hill, Ballard, Queen Anne, Central District are all unique to this episode.